What is Zen? What is enlightenment? How do we learn to live at peace with ourselves and others? Join us on our journey to discover the Buddhist way of life.
This week, we will begin a four-part series focusing on Dr. Duncan Williams. Dr. Williams is an associate professor of Japanese Buddhism at the University of California at Berkeley. We asked Dr. Williams about Buddhism and how it has influenced his life.
I like to think about my own life as a Buddhist and my own coming into being, thinking about the Japanese Buddhist word goen, the mysterious or strange karmic conditions that have to be coming together to create a person, create a relationship, create an event. My own birth actually comes from a mysterious connection between my British father and Japanese mother. My father had left England when he was age 21 after having served in the British Navy, and his claim to fame was that he hitchhiked around the world, taking a year and a half to circumambulate the world, and he ended up in Japan, where he met my mother on the island of Kyushu, where my mother originally was from Yamanashi Prefecture, but they met in Kyushu at a udon store. And there, him being a young hitchhiker from England with no money, he apparently had ordered a plain bowl of udon noodles. And my mother, seeing that, felt somewhat sorry for him that he could only buy the cheapest kind of noodles. And so she added, and apparently at that time, noodles cost 5 yen, the plain kind. And if you added an extra yen or two, you could get some different toppings. So that's exactly what she did, and that's how they got to know each other. So I think of this story as the goen or 5 yen story, which is a play on the word goen, or this mysterious karmic circumstances that bring people together.
Williams was born to a British father and a Japanese mother. Since childhood, he felt that there were two different identities existing inside him.
Growing up in our teenage years, asking the question, who am I? Am I Japanese or am I Western? And in the case of my family, am I Buddhist or am I Christian? These kind of questions would have me think as I was growing up. I went to at first a Japanese school, a kindergarten, before entering an international school where English was the main language of instruction, and so I was brought up that way. But also, living in Japan from my birth, I found that my Japanese identity was also emphasized. My mother made me learn the Japanese language. She would only speak to me in Japanese. I would have to always reply to her in Japanese. And she made us go to things like the local kendo at the local police station, learning Japanese martial arts, learning calligraphy. So in addition to the language, the culture as well. And so part of that involved also learning about my heritage and my ancestors on the Japanese side, coming into touch with my Japanese Buddhist heritage. Ultimately, after high school, when I had been struggling with this kind of question of identity, I began to become more and more interested in Buddhism. Buddhism as a way to think about identity. And in fact, there's a famous phrase by Zen master Dogen, the medieval founder of Soto Zen Buddhism. To study the Buddha way is to study the self. To study the self is to forget the self. And so on. But it's an indication that the investigation of the self, who am I, that question of who I am, that very much is at the heart of Buddhist practice. And as I started to enter Buddhism, its notions that the self is not a fixed, permanent, solid thing, but rather empty of self-nature, became a valuable way for me to think about myself as being ultimately empty, ultimately free, and therefore being able to incorporate both my Japanese side and my British side, both my Buddhist side as well as my Christian side. And so it was for me a way, Buddhism was for me a way to come to terms with my own questions of identity.
When Williams was 17, he decided to go to Reed College in Portland, Oregon. There, he learned about Buddhism from a scholarly point of view. While in Portland, he became seriously devoted to the practice of Zen, which he had started during his high school years in Japan. Later, he met a person who would significantly influence him later on in his life.
It was also in this period that I met my teacher, somebody who would become my kind of main ordination teacher. His name was Ogasawara Ryugen, a priest in Japan, and the abbot of a temple called Kotakuji, a temple in Matsumoto City, Nagano Prefecture. And I got to know him during my college days. And there, at that time, I remember in my very first meeting, he addressed that question of identity very square on. And he said, Duncan, if you want to really understand the Buddha Dharma, to understand Buddhism, you must learn how not to stick to one extreme or another. And he told me something about the middle path, the middle way, or Chudo, which is sometimes an alternate name for the Buddhist path. And he said, you know, Duncan, you're both British and Japanese. You both have a Buddhist upbringing and a Christian upbringing. The Buddhist method, the Buddhist approach, is to find that middle path in between and not stick, not get attached to one side or another. With this kind of advice from the very beginning, I began to be interested in maybe pursuing not just the academic study of Buddhism, but the practice of Buddhism in a more committed way. And so I would ask Reverend Ogasawara Ryugen periodically about the possibilities of becoming a Buddhist priest.
When he was in college, Williams used to go back to Japan during the summer to continue his practice of Zen. He continued to do this even during his master's and doctoral studies. In the summer of 1993, he shaved his head and became ordained.
At Harvard, I decided that I would study my own particular tradition, Soto Zen Buddhism, but try to look at that tradition in a way that scholars in the past had not looked at it. In part because I was a practitioner within that tradition, I had seen that sometimes the way that scholars of Buddhism had talked about the Zen tradition tended to idealize what the Buddhist life, especially the Zen Buddhist life, was all about. When we think of the word Zen, often images come up in our heads of mysterious exchanges called koans between Zen master and disciple. We think of certain kinds of meditative traditions. We think of raking Zen gardens, that kind of thing. So kind of high culture and Japanese culture, as well as these kind of iconoclastic, antinomian kind of ways of approaching the world. But what I had actually seen with my own eyes in terms of the lived practice of Zen was that very few people had these iconoclastic exchanges, very few people engaged in the high culture that we typically associate with Zen, and that for most people, Zen Buddhism was much more down-to-earth practice, much like the Buddhism that many Buddhists practiced. And so I was interested to look at what were the common elements of the Zen tradition compared to other forms of Buddhism in Japan. And that made me look at the history of Zen. So as a historian, I started to look at that, but I was interested in the way in which Zen, as well as Japanese Buddhism as a whole, interacted in Japanese culture and society, not just in the past, but in the present. And that's another kind of area of research that I began to be interested in, not only as I was finishing my PhD at Harvard, but as I began my career thereafter, teaching at universities such as Brown University, Trinity College, UC Irvine, and most recently, UC Berkeley. And those kind of more contemporary issues, the ways in which Buddhism might be relevant to our contemporary situations, began to get me interested in issues such as the ways in which Buddhism might be understood to understand issues of the environment, issues of nonviolence and peace, as well as ways in which the contemporary development of American Buddhism.
Once, Dr. Williams questioned his identity in between his two different cultures. Through Buddhism, he was able to better understand himself. He accepted both cultures as his identity. How is he now dealing with these two different cultural identities?
So as I began to look into modern or contemporary Buddhism, historical Buddhism, as a scholar, I also began to also further my practice of Buddhism. And after I became ordained as a monk in Japan, I tried to find ways to be engaged with Buddhist communities here in the United States. And so I began to wear two hats, as it were. On the one hand, a scholar in the academy, and on the other hand, serving as a priest, serving people who may want to ask questions about Buddhism, practicing together with them as a Sangha. So in some sense, I tried to take my teacher's words to heart, not attaching to either side, trying to find a way to freely move both as an academic and as a priest. And just as I had found a way to reconcile in myself this idea that I'm both Japanese as well as Western, I also tried to find a way to find this middle path where I could freely traverse in the realms of an academic life as well as the life of a priest.
Next week, Dr. Williams will talk about Japanese American Buddhism. We hope you'll join us.
This program was brought to you by Bukkyo Dendo Kyokai, Society for the Promotion of Buddhism. The founder of Bukkyo Dendo Kyokai, late Dr. Yehan Numata, believed that the Buddhist teachings could assist in bringing lasting peace and happiness for all of humanity. Society for the Promotion of Buddhism is dedicated to continue Dr. Numata's dreams of sharing Buddhism with others by distributing the teachings of Buddha books, which are translated to 42 different languages and donated to hotels worldwide. For further information or to request a copy of the book, please visit www.bdkamerica.org or call 626-369-5035.